all of the time that you're spending engaging on social media is time that you're not spending engaging in interpersonal complexity in the real world. If you're not practicing those skills of being with others in the real world, it's going to contribute to feelings of loneliness, higher levels of anxiety and isolation, and it's going to make it more difficult to form those real world relationships that you need to sustain yourself. The algorithms blindly pull you into that experience by knowing what's going to capture your attention and feeding you more and more of that stuff. They don't care whether it's good for you or bad for you. And if you're struggling with something and the algorithm catches that and starts pulling you towards more and more about that thing, there are no guarantees that the direction is going to be good for you. If you think about having a scale within yourself of calmness to stress, you might walk around at a level of 4 most of the time, but if you're looking at a feed and getting angrier and angrier, you're going to go up to a 7 or an 8, but then you're going to come down to a 5, and then you're going to go up to a 9 or a 10, and then you're going to come down to a 6, and it can actually make you more sensitive to being angry or stressed out or anxious more of the time.
Aaron, welcome to The Meaning of Men. What do you want people to take away from our conversation today?
Right. I think the number one thing, definitely from the perspective of being a psychotherapist, is this idea of interrelational complexity. It's kind of a mouthful of words, but it's about the complexity that arises when two people or more are meeting in real life and the challenges that represents, whether there's love there, attraction, conflict, difference, sameness, that a lot of the time that we're spending online and on social media reduces down the complexity of relationships, and we're losing the practice of doing those things well. So it's about how you develop that interrelational complexity yourself.
Give me a sense of how you started on this journey doing the work that you're doing. What is your background?
Well, yeah, the short answer is I've done just about everything. So I didn't really have a direction early in life. I was a bookseller. I sold briefcases. I traveled. I was an English teacher. I was a tarot card reader for a brief time, way back in my youth. And then I kind of stumbled upon Freud first in a master's degree I was doing, and just got very, very excited about psychotherapy and the idea that you could really dig down into the meanings that people have about their lives, look at the past, see how the past affects your present, and actually, be thoughtful and intentional about how you live your life rather than blindly repeating unconscious patterns over and over again.
I've been really looking forward to this conversation. I think social media is such a big topic around men's mental health and mental health in general. Feels like such a minefield, and it will be great to start to unpick some of that and start to get a better understanding of how we can possibly have a better relationship with social media, because obviously it's not going anywhere and it brings a lot of benefits too, but it would be good to maybe unpick some of the darker sides of it as well and get a better understanding of maybe how we can better manage it. It'd be interesting to start off getting an idea of how social media fundamentally has changed the way that men communicate about their emotions, compared to maybe like previous generations where they didn't have such platforms.
Right. It's a really good place to start. So, like all things, it's a double-edged sword, right? And I always kind of revert to this quote by a guy called Melvin Kranzberg about technology, where he says, technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. And the thing you've got to look at is any platform's non-neutrality. So how does a platform work? And then what does that enable or disable in the psychologies of the people using it? Okay. So the way lots of social media works, and it's different because if you're talking about Instagram, this is different than Facebook, it's different than Twitter, it's different than dating apps, right? So you have to kind of think about how each of those operate with people. But I would say in general, the two sides of the coin are this. On the one hand, social media has done a lot of work around psychoeducation and awareness of mental health issues and distress. So I think on the positive side, it's like people have a language for it, particularly men who previously had much less of a language for it in general. know that it's good to talk about things. They have a general sense of how emotions work. They have a general sense of the landscape around the kind of difficulties that you'll encounter mental health wise. Like, I think as an education thing, it's kind of good. There's some flaws that we can get into, right? The dark side of that coin is you get very little nuance on social media. You get everything is short, snaps of things. So you don't really get depth. You don't really get complexity. So what it often offers is a very simplistic view, and often there's also a lot of bad information on there. So you can get incorrect information or simplified information that kind of can make you think, okay, well, it's an anxiety disorder, or I have ADHD, or I'm an introvert, and that kind of answers a question and then doubles up on an identity around these really simplistic ideas that doesn't let you really engage with it at a deeper level that would be required. So the knowledge is great, but getting all of your information and trying to solve your problems with the knowledge that you're picking up off social media is not so great.
And I guess it feeds into this narrative of attention spans getting shorter, and so these bite-sized bits of information suit our lifestyles. But as you said, without the full context, sometimes even the best meaning posts can be quite damaging. And then, as you said, obviously there's a lot of misinformation, and we're gonna dive into algorithms a little bit later as well, because obviously that's largely dictating what we're seeing as well. What you said there around the different platforms actually was interesting. I hadn't thought that different platforms can offer potentially different challenges. So if you were comparing something like Instagram to Facebook, for example, what would be maybe some of the different challenges that each one of those platforms might have against each other?
Okay, so the main thing that most people will think of is what's the initial impact. So Instagram tends to be more image based. You can share images on Facebook, but there's a little bit more room for dialogue on Facebook. So the communication method is a little bit different. So where they share lots of dangers. So one of the kind of harmful elements of social media might be something like social comparison, right? That's where we think about our own lives, we compare it to people out there, and then we feel less than in relation to that. So we all know that people put on a persona on all of these things, but it might be that you go on Facebook and somebody's talking about their career or talking about their family or talking about their holidays and things that are going great for them, and you're thinking that you're not doing as well as they are, right? So that's a kind of form of social comparison. Something image-based like Instagram, you might be more vulnerable to, say, body comparison. So if you're in an algorithm or in a hole, whatever you want to call it, where you're looking at lots of like really fit men's bodies and you're interested in building up yourself and you're always coming in less than that, then you could have that could introduce a kind of self-image issue or body dysmorphia or that sort of thing, where maybe, and again, these aren't mutually exclusive, but maybe you go onto Facebook and then that could be more of provoke more of a status situation or a political filter bubble, or so it's really how are you using that thing, and then what does it enable you to step into?
I think it's good to have an awareness of that, because people obviously aren't going to stop using these platforms because they obviously have benefits as well. But I think if you've got an awareness, even at a high level, more of a conscious awareness of where some of the pitfalls are for specific channels, I feel like that could maybe help your approach and how you use it as well. So that's very interesting. What are some of the biggest psychological challenges that men face when engaging with social media? We sort of touched on maybe a couple of them there, like body dysmorphia, for example, when you're looking at images on Instagram. But what are some of the other challenges around it?
So I see this in like two fundamental levels. So one of them you kind of touched on both of them, but one of them is kind of the addictive nature and the consequences for attention and stuff like that. So it's like thinking about how you use social media. So doom scrolling, how many hours you're wasting looking at these short videos, what it sucks from you when you could be doing something different. So that's kind of the more like dopamine cycle, the habituated cycle, the forms of social media addiction, and I'm using air quotes here. So it's how much you need it, how much you're feeling terrible when you don't have it. That's kind of like I'd say that's like a high level thing. It's like how you use it. Yeah. And then the second level is like, okay, what's it doing to you? So when you're on there, are you engaging in negative social comparison? Are you finding yourself going deeper into an ideological bubble that's making you feel particular ways about yourself, about your masculinity, about women, about the world, about your politics? Are you being, radicalized in some kind of ways? Are you being shielded from different opinions? And then I guess the third kind of thing attached to both of those things is all of the time that you're spending engaging on social media is time that you're not spending engaging in interpersonal complexity in the real world, right? So if that starts to take over, and it is relational, like I want to like double down on that. Like people are communicating with other people for the most part. It's not just going on in your head, right? But if you're not practicing those skills of being with others and working through others also in the real world, it's going to contribute to feelings of loneliness, higher levels of anxiety and isolation, and it's going to make it more difficult to kind of come back into the real world and form those real world relationships that you need to sustain yourself.
You're talking about dopamine there, and I don't have a huge understanding of it, but would it be fair to say that, so you obviously get dopamine hits from like when you're scrolling through and seeing different videos, and if the more that you're doing that, do you almost need to sort of like keep doing it to keep getting those dopamine hits? Because I guess like the more that you do it, you almost become numb to it a little bit. And so then you need to do even more of it to get those dopamine hits and see even more of those videos, and maybe even like more extreme videos maybe to keep getting those hits of dopamine.
I mean, that's exactly it. And you can think of it very much like an addiction to a substance, right? So you kind of, you reach a level of tolerance and then you start to need more of it. And sadly, but predictably, the default settings on most of our social media game towards that because it wants to increase engagement, right? So yes, it's going to increase, your tolerance levels are going to increase, and you're going to be looking for more and spending more time on it. And the double dark part of it is what tends to get us going dopaminergically, I probably pronounced that incorrectly, right, is high sensation feelings. That's why feelings like rage and anger tend to transmit more and be more socially contagious when you go online, because they get us all riled up. And even though you think of that as a negative feeling, it's a high level of sensation, and that's what kind of makes it addictive. So you end up regulating yourself upwards. So if you think about having a scale within yourself of calmness to intensity or stress, you might walk around at a level of 4 most of the time. But if you're looking at a feed on X, Twitter, Blue Sky, whatever it is, and getting angrier and angrier, you're going to go up to a 7 or an 8, but then you're going to come down to a 5, and then you're going to go up to a 9 or a 10, and then you're going to come down to a 6. And it can actually make you more sensitive to being angry or stressed out or anxious more of the time. You actually regulate upwards.
You're talking there about real world relationships. I'd like to get an idea of what some of the differences are between like social online relationships and real world interpersonal relationships. Like what would be, if I just had all of my friendship groups and I was just speaking to people online, why is that a problem? Like why is that a problem versus like actually seeing people in the real world and having those relationships?
Okay. Well, first I want to say, I mean, they are real world relationships, and we can get into a real ham sandwich about how you should define the difference between face-to-face and online, right? So I do want to acknowledge that they're real relationships. They're not always real people, but most of the time they're real people that you're having those relationships with online, but it lacks the relational complexity. So a really good example that I like to use of this is ghosting, right? So back in the day, and that day wasn't so long ago, but it was before the time of probably many of your listeners. If you went on a date with someone and they weren't going to be for you, you'd have to let them down in some way, right? Like you would have to meet them again and say, I don't want to go out with you again, right? There would be some kind of difficult, hopefully respectful, kind of painful, kind of uncomfortable parting. Yeah. what social media and our technology enables us to do often is to skip the hard part. So what happens when we ghost each other is we don't want to take the risk, or we don't want to expose ourselves to the discomfort of letting someone down or telling someone that you don't want to see them anymore. So you just ghost them, right? Then that person is stuck with all these uncomfortable feelings because they don't know what's been going on. You're probably stuck with them too. It's probably happened with you. And that's like a really serious emotional, psychological consequence of just not working through an issue. And that's like a really basic one. So you talk about politics or disagreements or conflict. You can go onto Twitter and you can say things to people that if you said face to face, you might get, punched in the face for it, right? Like there would be a real risk, if not a physical harm, then of a face-off, right? Real life conflict. So it's easier to do that online at a distance than it is face-to-face. So most of us will have to encounter other people in the real world face-to-face, regardless of how much we're doing online. And if we don't have the skills to do that, we're really inhibited from forming nourishing relationships. And it just happens to be that you need to have enough real world offline nourishing relationships to thrive psychologically. It's as important as food and shelter and warmth, that there are people in your lives that you can speak to, you can have conflict with, recover from, that you can care for, that care for you, that there are breakdowns, but there are recoveries and repairs. That's like the emotional nutrition that you need from relationships that you can avoid on social media. And the metaphor I like to use is it's like nutrition, right? Like the stuff that you need to eat that's good for you isn't always as tasty as the stuff that isn't. But if you try to sustain yourself on junk food, it's going to be problematic in the long term. And if you try to sustain yourself on junk food relationships, it's the same kind of thing. You need nutritious interpersonal complexity.
Before we dive back into the episode, if you're enjoying these conversations, please do hit that subscribe button and leave a review. These two actions really make a huge difference and help the show reach more people who can benefit from these discussions. Let's keep building this community together. Thanks for being part of it. Back to the episode. And it's like any skill, I guess. If you're not using it, you lose it, essentially. And as you were saying there, it's inevitable that you're going to have these moments where you need those skills. And if you're not practicing them, then obviously that's going to lead to some issues. Yeah. We started talking about some of the aspects of social media, like doom scrolling, for example. What are some of the specific aspects of social media usage, so scrolling, posting, engaging, that are the most harmful to a man's mental well-being?
So everybody hates the answer, right? Because it's really dependent on the person who's scrolling. So there isn't necessarily one straightforward answer to that. So it could be that the individual who happens to be proclived towards an addictive personality, that the main problem is just the time spent online at the expense of time spent elsewhere, right? That could be a really serious problem. For the person that's coming in with body image issues and then doubling down on that by going onto Instagram and following all of these like body pages that is making them feel worse about themselves, that becomes the problem. Across the board, the relational problem that I've been discussing underlies a lot of this. So when you get this interpersonal complexity, this is, in psychology, we call this like authentic recognition. So you're in a relationship with someone, you see them for what you like about them, you see them for your faults, right? Like you tolerate, say, a romantic partner's annoying things because you like other things about them, right? That's like authentic recognition. You see the person ideally pretty much for who they are. When we go online, you're getting or not getting validation instead of recognition. So if you're, say, one of these hot body Instagram people and you're getting a lot of positive feedback for how your body is looking, you're going around seeking validation, which is, again, it's like the junk food version of recognition. So you're getting lots of likes, lots of shares, lots of comments. But it's not really recognition. They're not really seeing you for who you are. They're just seeing this small piece of you. And while that feels good, there's a consequence because you're not really being seen. So people with issues around how they value themselves, self-image, self-value, self-esteem, that can make it worse, even though you think you're solving the problem because maybe you've got yourself into the body that you want or nearly want, and you're getting all this attention for it. You still feel bad because you're not getting that nutritious thing. You're getting validation instead of recognition.
I want to talk a little bit about algorithms because I think it's helpful to have an idea of how they work, and I've only recently got my head around some of the basics and what's driving the posts that are coming up on my social media accounts. Can you just give us an idea of how they work, and how they can unfortunately exploit vulnerabilities of men online?
Yeah. So again, speaking as a psychotherapist and not as a developer, my understanding is not is not from an IT specialist, right? But what I do understand about algorithms is what they're intended to do and broadly how they work. Now, the kind of bird's eye view is that all of these platforms are run as businesses, right? So the desired consequence for a business is to make profit. The way to make profit is to increase engagement so that people who are on there are seeing the ads that people are paying for to do that. So the algorithms basically blindly want to pull you into that experience by monitoring what you're looking at, knowing what you're pausing at, knowing what your interests are, knowing what's going to capture your attention, and feeding you more and more of that stuff. The algorithms these days, and this could change, and I wish it would, but the algorithms don't really care whether what they're showing you is true or false. They don't care whether it's good for you or bad for you. They don't care whether they do care whether it's pulling you down a hole, so long as you're spending that time on the hole on that particular platform. So it creates, people will be familiar with filter bubbles. It creates filter bubbles that are built around your interests and probably the interests of related interests to what you're looking at. So it'll suggest things that are related to what you're looking at. And if you have a curiosity about something, or you're struggling with something and the algorithm catches that and starts pulling you towards more and more about that thing, there are no guarantees that the direction that that's pulling you in is going to be good for you. Yeah. So if you're struggling with your idea of what it is to be a man, it might be pulling you towards the Andrew Tate direction of a particular idea of what that looks like, with quite simplistic ideas about that you might be attracted to, putting you in the way of other people who share these ideas. And then you get this confirmation bias thing going on. And then everything just kind of narrows and narrows and narrows. And it can actually affect your own identity, how you see yourself in the world, how you see men, how you see women. And this is just a perspective, right? It's not throwing you down different kinds of perspectives or challenging your point of view. In a way, it can be kind of radicalizing.
And it seems like you just see the extremes of things as well, like you don't see a lot of the middle ground, because that's not like the loudest, voice that you're going to hear. I think the algorithms, from what I understand, sort of like pick up on the most extreme versions of those sides of the story as well, which, as you said, sort of creates a real rabbit hole. And I guess just having like more of an awareness of how this works helps. Is there anything else that people can do to obviously not get over the algorithms, because they are what they are, but just help in terms of like using social media in a more healthy and productive way?
Yeah. Well, you had a really good point there about the loudest voices, and I don't have the numbers in front of me at the moment, but on the platform formerly known as Twitter, the tweets that you see generally come from a very small proportion of the people who are actually posting, like, less than 10%. And again, I don't have the exact number in front of me, but around less than 10% of the people on Twitter are producing something like 80% of the stuff that you see. And then most of the rest of that is retweets or comments on that sort of thing. And what tends to happen because of those algorithms is, as you say, it's the loudest voices, because the moderate voices don't really get heard because they're not as engaging as the ones that are going to get you riled up. So what you're seeing is a really distorted view of what seems like the mass public, and it's just not. So like a really good example of this is the Andrew Tate thing. So there was some research out this year that said that in the UK, about 45% of people, sorry, 45% of men had a positive view of Andrew Tate, and less than 1% of women had a positive view of him. Now, you could put that down to what he's saying on the one hand, but you could also put it down to the information that people are getting and how they're processing that information. So if you have, broadly half the population being women and the other half being men, and this distortion of how this idea is being kept is a really good example of how people are not getting the same information.
In your opinion, why do you think influencers like Andrew Tate are so powerful in my view, a negative way? Is it because the ideas that he's pushing are generally very easy to understand, simplistic, and maybe directed to really make men feel good about themselves? Like, I when I hear what he says, I just really struggle to understand what the appeal is. But obviously, there is a big appeal. I'd love to kind of get your view on that.
Right. So developmentally, it is easier to see the world in black and white terms than it is to see in shades of gray. Right? When we're babies, that's kind of how we perceive the world. Right and wrong, this or that, black or white, and we hope that as we become adults, we start to see that there's nuance and complexity in there. And you can see, just look at the political structure at the moment. People are responding to clearly irrational solutions to very complex problems because there's this fantasy that it can be solved with mass deportations, right? Or with money, or with whatever you want to call it, right? Really easy, usually quite harmful answers. So when you give the listeners the benefit of the doubt, which I think we should, because you have to understand where that will comes from, right? It's like, oh, gosh, what a relief if there's just an easy answer and there's one way to be a man and I can just do that, right? And there are all these other people encouraging me and cheering me on to do that thing. And then you look at the other side of that question and it's like, well, how are you supposed to be a man? It's like, well, it's really complicated. What kind of a man are you? And, what are your experiences in life and what kind of relationships do you want to have with other people? And there are all these different examples that you can choose from. And, you got to make choices yourself and it's not easy and blah, 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 blah. It's harder, right? So the simple answer is it's just easier to latch on to a simplistic answer. But in the long run, the consequences are going to come back and get you because the world isn't simple. And then when you're confronted with the reality of that complexity, you're not going to have the skills necessarily to do it. Unless those skills are surrounding yourself by the people who feel like exactly the same as you do.
What signs can men and their partners as well look for that may suggest that social media is having a damaging effect on their mental health?
Yeah. So bringing back in this idea of interpersonal complexity, I think you kind of have to look at how much of that is going on in any relationship, right? So if you imagine a couple who over time are talking less and less and less, can't have discussions around conflict. Someone, shuts down or walks out the door, can't sustain an idea that's different from theirs, maybe is losing friends that they've had for a long time and replacing them with people that they're meeting online, that the nature of their dialogue becomes kind of monologic, repeating ideas that feel quite similar, that don't really sound like they're coming from the person that you know. I think all of these sorts of things are indicators that there's a colonization process going on in somebody's mind. And if you imagine, you just clock time, right? If they're spending hours and hours and hours being exposed to these relatively simplistic views in algorithmic filter bubbles and less time among people with different views and working through things that are complicated, then you can kind of see how that's gonna kind of pan out.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then in terms of, I guess, practical advice for, again, men and also partners and friends as well, um, what advice would you give around having a more healthy relationship with social media? Because as we said, there are a lot of benefits to it and it's certainly not going away. So how can we create more of a balance and have a better relationship with it, do you think?
Okay, well, the number one thing is self awareness, I think, because generally, when people go down these holes, if they really are uh, honest with themselves, they'll recognize that it doesn't feel good, right? Like doom scrolling does not feel good. It might be compelling, but it doesn't feel good. It's like eating a whole tube of Pringles. Like maybe the first five are all right. And then you're eating them and you kind of don't want to anymore. So you have to be really honest when you're scrolling, like, I don't want to be doing this anymore. And then there's an active, you have to actively get in the way of that and stop that. That's harder because you're already in it. But I think the first call is like, okay, just be aware of your feelings when you're scrolling. And if it's not working for you, come off it, right? Then same kind of, I like Pringles and donuts, so I tend to use them as metaphors, right? Like, don't have them in your house if you're going to eat a whole roll of them. And the way we don't have it in our house, because we probably, most of us can't not have some kind of social media in some kind of way, or we want to have it in our life in some kind of a way. Don't use it by manufacturer defaults, because all of those defaults are made to keep you involved. So I, for example, I don't have any notifications turned on any of my social media, including WhatsApp. And on my phone, I don't even have email, because I don't want my technology to take my attention from me. I want to choose when I look at it. So there might be something waiting for me on Instagram, but I'll decide when I go on to Instagram and I'll look and I'll decide how much time I want to spend there. I'm not always great about that, and it takes some discipline, but it makes it much easier for yourself if you're not responding to their call to you. So you're making those decisions, right? So think about what you want to be doing. Think about how you can support yourself to do that. Limit your time on there. If it feels crap, stop doing it. Yeah. And then make more global decisions, just like you would around exercise or nutrition. Like, I don't want, 26% of my day mindlessly scrolling on social media, but maybe 11% I can manage. So what is that? I don't know. I can't really do math, but 2 hours or something, right? That even seems like a lot, but like, do your 2 hours. Don't do it before bed because it messes with your sleep. Put phones away when you're at the dinner table with family, lovers, friends, so that you can practice that interpersonal complexity. Make sure you have a real life, social life, and just be thoughtful and mindful about putting these things in order.
When you were talking about switching off the notifications, I was thinking that's a great idea, but if I'm someone that is on social media a lot, I could almost feel like the anxiety of it. Like, oh, I wonder if stuff's come in, or and trying to have that discipline to not just continuously check, because that just defeats the whole purpose of it, doesn't it? But I guess that's just kind
Mm-hmm.
of like a practice thing, right? Like the more that you do it and the more discipline that you have around it. The other thing I was thinking as well is um think about my own habits with social media. There are like generally times in the day that I will automatically go on and start scrolling. I wonder if one way around that could be recognizing that. So let's say, for example, like generally, I don't know, 7:30, kids are down, we're having dinner. That's generally when I will go on social media. Maybe trying to replace that with something else. So like consciously thinking, okay, rather than going on social media at this time, I'm going to do something else maybe,
Mm-hmm.
and then again just kind of like removing some of those blocks from your day, because it's a lot of it is habit, I guess, isn't it?
It is, and actually, you put your finger on something really important, which is the anxiety that arises when you're not doing it. So that's actually a really good indicator of a kind of dependence, right? So the way I was talking before about how you regulate yourself up to a general 7 rather than a 4, it takes time to regulate down. So you might, I mean, it's not like coming off heroin or something where there's like a really serious consequence of stopping all of a sudden. So you can stop and just see if you can tolerate that anxiety, because it will go. You can distract And that can be a short-term solution, but actually you want to start learning to be with yourself without having to be distracted ultimately as well, because that's part of what regulates yourself up. If you're distracting with a walk in nature or reading an analog book, that is a lower level distraction. So it's better, right? But we also want to, just like we want to have the skills to have interpersonal complexity, we want to have the skills to have personal time where we're not distracted and we can be aware of our feelings, right? You might find out that you have a daydream or that there's something you hadn't thought about before. So making space for that is really important. And identifying, it's not the worst thing in the world to come home after a really stressful day and want to have, like a nice strong scotch, right? But if you're doing that every day because you can't manage the stress, it's problematic. So if you can manage the come down from a day through scrolling and limit it, I don't think that's a problem. It's when it becomes a problem, and regulating yourself down where it's kind of in suitable parameters without being a saint about it. That's kind of the direction to look towards.
Something I just thought of as you were talking there around boredom, and actually sometimes boredom is a good thing. And I definitely find if I'm not doing something, I just pick up my phone and I'll just open something like social media or maybe go on another app. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I will literally open my phone and I won't even do anything. It's just the action of opening my phone because I literally cannot bear to just sit there and do nothing. And I'm like, why am I doing this? Like I've got nothing to check. I've got no notifications. I'm all up to date with everything, but I will still do it. It's so weird, isn't it? Like
it's
almost this battle with boredom. It's sometimes just need to be bored, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I really struggle with that myself. I struggle to read a book, if my phone is beside me because I'm doing the same thing. I'm looking at it and like, what am I looking for? And it's actually kind of a skill, and we're losing that skill. And actually, if you're a creative type, if you're into ideas work, even if you want to decide what you want to do with your life, or you want to think about, your next holiday or something, you need to produce space for that. And if we're constantly distracted, we're actually losing out on allowing our unconscious to like come up and give us ideas about stuff. So to develop the skill to at least be able to be bored, and as you were saying before you're bored, you'll probably be anxious. So we need to get through the anxious first, even to get to bored. Bored is a success in a way, because it means you kind of conquered some of that anxiety. I think there's a real treasure there, right? But you have to develop the skill to resist having to have something going, even for short periods of time. And you can practice that, put the phone in a drawer, just try it for like 20 minutes, right? Just see what it's like. You can bear it. You might be bored, you might be anxious, but it's 20 minutes without your phone. It's no big deal, right? And then you can kind of increase those time periods as well.
I want to touch on sleep a little bit as well. I definitely am guilty of checking social media just before I go to bed, or just being on my phone in general. And I know that that's probably not a good thing and affects my sleep, but I don't really know why. So could you maybe touch on that a little bit? And then if there's any tips around when you should have a hard line in terms of no social media by this time before you go to sleep, maybe.
Yeah. So again, there's kind of the two things. So one of them is kind of biological and the other one's more psychological, but of course both are both. But, biologically, the lights on your phones and your pads are not really good for your eyes and readying yourself to sleep. So ideally you should come off screens altogether at least an hour before you go to bed. So the guidance is like, don't even have them in your bedroom. Your bedroom is for sleeping, just like start that, because you need to regulate down to sleep as well as wanting to regulate down generally in life. So just the exposure to the light is a problem. Just the dopamine situation, the scrolling, the looking for more, because, it's engaging and it's sensational. You want to be more bored as you approach sleep. You don't want to be thinking about stuff. Then on kind of the more psychological end, it might be if you're on social media that you will have posted something that people start to respond to. So you start to get excited about that, or you start to get nervous about that because people don't like it, or you see something that pisses you off that somebody's posted or upsets you. And then you get into a thought loop about that, which gets in the way of your sleep. So all of these things are really disruptive. So I'm like really into analog before sleep. So like an hour before, off the phone. If you can, I think you need to set like an alarm clock rather than use your phone as a clock, because then it's nearby. read a book, do something that doesn't engage your brain, and just like use that time off social media because it really verifiably messes with sleep.
Is there a cutoff point? So if I'm going to bed at, let's say, 10, what would you maybe recommend?
The sleep hygiene people tend to recommend that your bed and bedroom are used for sleeping, reading, and sex, ideally, and that's it. So, like that, you're telling your brain by association when I come into this room, that's what it's there for. So, you don't even bring it in there. So, one of the things that I've done, but again, I'm not always great at it, is like I watch TV on my TV now. So, when I'm done, I go into the bedroom and I'm not taking a tablet with me because that's kind of like bringing the screen into the bedroom. So I think start with an hour, but the main idea is you have to regulate yourself downward. So if you're exciting yourself as you're approaching bedtime, that's probably a bad idea. So what do you need to do to kind of like bring the levels down?
Aaron, my last question for you today, again, going back to partners and friends, how could they maybe approach a conversation with a man in their life who might have an unhealthy relationship with social media and might not realize it, but it's having a detrimental effect on them?
Yeah. This is a hard one for the reasons that we've talked about, that the deeper you go into the hole, the harder it is to sustain interpersonal conflict and stuff, right? So ideally, and I know it's never ideal, catch it earlier rather than later. So when you start to see something happen, keep that conversation open. The main takeaway really is you want to minimize provoking defensiveness in the partner, right? So, excuse me, if it sounds accusatory, that's going to provoke defensiveness. So you need to stop, or I hate it when you, or something like that. We talk about using I language. Like, I find it really hard when you disappear for 3 hours in the evening, or I've noticed that we don't talk about things anymore and it's causing me some distress and worry, or I feel like the way we used to share different kinds of ideas isn't there anymore. It's like it's very one-sided and it's very hard to get into it with you. Can I understand that? So it can be hard because you might be feeling anxious, you might be feeling angry. Um, you have a right to those feelings, but if you want to open up conversation, if you can avoid making the other person defensive, be curious also about where they're coming from, what it's like for them, rather than deciding for them and telling them what to do. So what's going on? What are you finding interesting there? You know, can I understand that more? Maybe can you show me? They may not want to, but it's kind of like being together with it rather than coming apart.
Aaron, thank you so much for your time today. I think this has been a really important conversation to have because social media is such a big part of of our lives. I think one of my big takeaways is if you have a better understanding of how it works and how the different platforms work as well, then you can ultimately start to have a better relationship with it. And as I said, it's never going to be cut out of your life, but you can actually kind of use it to better effect. So thank you so much for sharing those insights today.
Well, thanks very much for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.